Hello everyone, this video is a follow-up to one I made about a 50-year-old chip, a 74151. I received a lot of excellent feedback from that video. Some commenters pointed out, rightly so, that my test method in that video wasn't really comprehensive. For example, I didn't cycle the enable pin, nor did I change the state of the input pins. So to address this, I've decided to get an Arduino to cycle the chip's inputs and monitor its outputs. This way, it's possible to more thoroughly evaluate the chip. For those unfamiliar with the 74151, I recommend you watch my first video about it. I'll leave a link in the video description below. I'll test this chip by selecting an input pin through pins S0 to S2. Then input 0 will be set high. This high bit will then be shifted through the other inputs. Once this bit shifting is complete, input 0 will again be set high, the next input pin selected, and the bit shifted across the inputs again. This will give us a total of 64 permutations, with 8 input pins being selected and 8 input pins being sequentially set high. With the enable pin reset to 0, the non-inverting output, which I'll simply call Z, will be high only when the selected input pin is high. In all other cases, Z will be low. The inverting output, or bar Z, will always be the opposite state of output Z. To ensure the correct functioning of the enable pin, this test will be repeated with the enable pin set high in order to disable the chip. Regardless of input pin selected or input pin state, outputs Z and bar Z will be low and high respectively. This is a brief overview of the schematic. We have the Arduino, we have the 74151 chip under test, and the interconnections. The Arduino transmits data to the individual input pins. There are 8 of those. We have some LEDs here to keep track of what's going on. The input on the chip is selected by these 3 pins here on the Arduino. The enable pin on this chip is controlled by the Arduino as well, so pin 11 controls the high or low state of the enable pin. The output of the 74151, the non-inverting output and the inverting output, these both go to LEDs as well, so we can visually monitor what's happening. These pins are also read by the Arduino for error checking purposes. For test 1, we'll test the chip in the condition of the chip being disabled. So the Arduino will sequentially select an input, and we'll see this reflected in these 3 LEDs here. Select from input 0 to 7. While a single input is selected, a single bit will be shifted left across all of the input pins, and this will be shown here from D0 through to D7. The number of errors detected during a test by the Arduino will be displayed on this bank of LEDs at the end of the test. For example, in this case, I ran the test with the chip disabled and tied the Arduino input monitoring the Z output high. In this state, the Z pin should be reading low throughout the whole test. We've cycled through 8 inputs and shifted the input bit 8 times. 8 by 8 is 64. With the chip disabled, we would have expected the Z output pin to be low 64 times. However, as far as the Arduino is concerned, it was high 64 times. So the error count of 64 is displayed here in binary. To check that, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. So we'll return this input to the Arduino back to the actual LED. The expected output of this test is that the non-inverting output will stay low, the inverting output will stay high. If this is in the incorrect state, this error will be counted as well. So when I press the reset button on the Arduino, this bank of LEDs will all flash on and then off to indicate the start of the test. And now let's start the test. So the enable pin is set high. We can see our address selection here. For each address selected or each input selected, we sweep through all the data bits, all the input pins. Our non-inverting output should remain 0. Our inverted output should remain high in this condition. We have no errors on the display. We've cycled through all our combinations, so the disable function of this chip works. This time we'll run the test again. Same conditions. The chip will be disabled, but I've removed the delay from within the Arduino program, so this time the test will run extremely quickly. So let's start. And we're finished, and we can see there are no errors. So another pass. This is what it looks like on an oscilloscope. The three top traces are the selector pin inputs, and the blue trace at the bottom is the non-inverting or Z output. In this second test condition, we'll repeat the test as it was before, cycling through each input and then sweeping across all of the inputs for each input selected. In this case, though, the enable pin will be low, which means the chip will be enabled. So we should expect to see the Z or non-inverting output reflect the state of the pin which is selected at the time. So let's start. Test starts. You can see sequentially as we select the input, as it goes high here, we see it reflected on the output. The test is complete. We've stepped through all of the input selection pins, and in each case, the non-inverting or Z output reflected the state of the selected input correctly, as did the bar Z or inverting output, since we have no errors recorded here. And just for the sake of consistency, I've removed the delay from the program, so we'll run this program again and see what the outcome is. Okay, the test is complete, no errors. Once again, this is what the output looks like on an oscilloscope. The top three traces are the selector pin inputs, cycling through 0 to 7 in binary, and the blue trace at the bottom is the Z or non-inverting output. And you'll notice that as expected, the output goes high later and later as the inputs are sequentially selected. Again, just for the sake of consistency, to test the error checking, I've taken the input for the non-inverting output, I've connected that to 0 volts, and so if I run the test again, we should count our errors on the output here. And so we have 1, 2, 4, 8 errors. We were expecting this pin to go high 8 times, which is correct, because we have 8 inputs. Each input will go high only once, and so the program has detected 8 errors. So far in this video, I've swept through the input pins while holding the input pin select address static. Another test that could be done would be to reverse this, so holding a given input high while sweeping the addresses. But for the purposes of this video, I'll just leave the testing as it is at this point. For those interested, I'll go into more detail of the test setup and finish up with a test of my chip from 1972. Now for an extremely quick overview of the Arduino program. At the start we have our variables and our pin assignment. So we've got Arduino pin 11 as our output to set the enable pin, and we're reading the outputs from the chip on pins 12 and 13. And the delay, which slows the program down enough for us to see it, is set by this variable here. In the setup, we've set the lower 4 bits of port B as outputs, so that includes the pins that select the input on the 151 and also the enable pin. The other pins on port B are set as inputs, and we read the outputs of the 74151 through those. Port D is set to all outputs. That's where we send our shifted bit to the input pins on the chip. To punctuate the start of the test, we set all of the pins on port D high. We can see that in the LEDs. We keep them high for a second, switch them off, leave them off for a second, and then start the main test. So the test is mediated by the main loop here. We start by enabling the 151 by setting the enable pin low. We go through the main stepping sequence here. I'll discuss that shortly. And then once that's finished, we disable the chip again, and then we sit in an infinite loop displaying the error count. So the main stepping part of the program is here. So we have 8 pins to select. We'll call those addresses. We step through that 8 times, and each time we step through once, we shift our data bit 8 times. Once we've gone through our 8 bits, we just do that again until we've selected all of the pins. So the address increment, or incrementing the select pin, we select the next pin in the sequence with this short routine here. So our address count is the next pin we want to select. We read port B, or that we AND that to update the address on the output, and then that's sent to the 151, and then we increment the address count, which will take us to the next pin selection on the next time around. Once we've stepped the address, we shift our bit 8 times, and we watch the outputs. And so what we do then is, to verify that it's working, we have to do 2 basic tests. The first is to check that the pin that we've selected and the output match. So if the pin that's currently high is, say, input 2, that's bit 3 or binary 4. If the address we've selected or the pin we've selected is the same as that, then we would expect the Z output to be 1, the bar Z to be 0. And so we confirm that here. If it's the opposite, then we increment our error count. Likewise, if the pin we've selected is not high, but is a 0, then we'd expect to see 0 on the output, the Z output, or 1 on the bar Z output. And again, we just check that. If it's the opposite of what we expect, then we increment the error count. This is our delay that we set at the start, and then we just shift the bit to the next position on our input selector pins. And then finally, once we've cycled through that 8 times, we set the least significant bit or input 0 to 1, and then we go back here and do it all again until we've gone through each of the input pin selections. Once that's completed, then we show our error count. So this final test is with my oldest chip, the oldest chip I have of any type. Again, it's a 74151. It was manufactured in the 52nd week of 1972, and it was manufactured by ITT. Now the legs on this chip are too short to properly engage with the little contacts in my breadboard, so I tried sticking it in an IC socket, but that only helped marginally. So what I'll have to do is just hold the chip down while we run the test. And success, no errors. Let me get rid of the delay in the program and we'll try it again. And again, no errors. Perfect. Well, this video has gone on way too long. For those who've continued this far into the video, I really appreciate you hanging around. Just to finish off, one final image comparing the relative propagation times of two chips. The one on the right is the oldest one I have, 7252. The one on the left was manufactured in the 17th week of 1996. Relatively new, but yeah, almost 30 years old, hard to believe. Between the two we see a difference in the propagation time between the switching of the input and the changing of the output. Still, very impressive for a very old chip. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, if you've noticed any mistakes, or if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and have a terrific day.